I'll never forget the sound of those words. My son stood in the doorway of his bedroom, arms crossed, eyes darting anywhere but at me, and he said it, "I don't love you anymore." I froze. My mind scrambled to find the right response, but nothing came out. Just silence. I don't know if you've ever felt a physical ache in your chest that comes from more than pain. It's like your heart drops into your stomach. That's what I felt in that moment. This was my boy. My little buddy who used to climb onto my lap just to watch cartoons together. My son, who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during church. And now, in a single breath, it felt like that bond had shattered. The first thought that rushed into my head was, where did I go wrong? I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain myself. I even wanted to defend my parenting choices. But as I stood there, I could tell that none of that would reach him. His eyes were guarded, his body stiff. He was hurting, and in some way, I had become the target of that hurt. If you're a parent, you might know that mix of shock, confusion, and deep sadness when your child pushes you away. But here's the question I wrestled with that day: when your child closes their heart to you, what can you do to open it again? I didn't know it at the time, but God was already working on the answer. A few hours later, I'd find myself sitting across from our pastor in his little office at church. His Bible was open, the pages worn from years of use. He didn't lecture me. He didn't give me a parenting manual. Instead, he turned to a passage that would break me down and build me back up in ways I didn't think were possible. And before I share that verse, before I tell you what he said and how it changed everything, I want to take you back to the days before this moment. Because the truth is, words like "I don't love you anymore" don't just come out of nowhere. There's a story behind them. You see, the weeks leading up to that day had been tense in our home. I had been working long hours. I thought I was providing for my family the best way I knew how. But somewhere in the busyness, I started missing the small moments, the bedtime talks, the board games, even just sitting together and listening. My son started spending more time in his room. I told myself it was just him getting older, but deep down, I knew something was shifting. I just didn't want to face it. And then came that day, the argument, the frustration, and the words that cut deeper than anything I'd ever heard from him. Friend, I want you to know, this story isn't about being a perfect dad. It's about being a broken dad who needed the grace of God to love his son the way God loves us. And that's why I'm sharing it, not because I got everything right, but because I didn't, and yet God still made a way. So stay with me, because in a few minutes, you're going to hear the exact scripture that changed the way I see my role as a father, and it might just change the way you see your relationships too. The day my son said those words didn't come out of nowhere. If I'm honest, the cracks in our relationship had been forming for a while, tiny fractures that I kept ignoring, telling myself, he's just going through a phase. But phases don't usually leave you feeling like you're strangers in the same house. It started subtly. I'd come home from work, tired and distracted, and instead of running up to greet me like he used to, he'd barely look up from whatever he was doing. Sometimes it was his video games, sometimes his phone, sometimes just staring at the ceiling. I'd ask, "How was your day?" and get a shrug. Maybe a fine, if I was lucky. At first, I brushed it off. Kids grow up. They get moodier. They want more space. That's normal, right? But deep down, I felt the shift, the unspoken distance that was stretching between us like a rubber band ready to snap. The tension grew during the weeks before the breaking point. I was buried in work deadlines, and he was buried in his own little world. Our conversations turned into quick exchanges about chores, homework, and whether he'd cleaned his room. Gone were the silly jokes at dinner, the late-night snack raids, the random "I love you, Dad" moments that used to light up my day. And honestly, I was guilty too. I had started choosing efficiency over connection. Instead of asking about his day and listening with real curiosity, I was checking off a mental to-do list: homework done, trash taken out, bedtime respected. In my mind, I was keeping the household running. In his mind, I was just barking orders. Then came the argument. It started over something small, it almost always does. I had asked him, for the third time, to take the trash out. He rolled his eyes, mumbled something under his breath, and kept playing his game. My patience, already worn thin from a rough day at work, snapped. "Pause the game and take it out now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't move. "Did you hear me?" I asked again, this time sharper. That's when he exploded. He jumped up, slammed the controller down, and shouted, "You never listen to me. You don't care about what I want. You only care about telling me what to do." I fired back without thinking. Words spilled out, defensive, frustrated, and louder than they needed to be. I told him he was being disrespectful. I told him he needed to learn responsibility. I told him a lot of things. Things that might have been true, but in that moment, truth without love felt like an attack. And then, in the middle of it, his face hardened, and he threw the words that would echo in my heart for days: "I don't love you anymore." The room went quiet. My anger drained instantly, replaced with a hollow ache. I wanted to take back everything I just said, but I didn't know how. I stood there, frozen, as he stormed into his room and slammed the door so hard the picture frames on the hallway wall rattled. For a long time, I just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. I thought about all the moments I had missed: the baseball game I didn't go to because of a work meeting, the school project I didn't help with because I was on my laptop, the nights I told him I was too tired to play. The truth was, he wasn't wrong. I had been more focused on managing him than connecting with him. I had become the rules dad instead of the relationship dad. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the argument, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. I prayed, not polished prayers, just raw, desperate words whispered into the dark: "God, I don't know how to fix this. Please help me." The next morning, I went through the motions, got ready for work, made coffee, checked my phone. But all I could think about was the look on his face. The hurt. The anger. The wall between us. I knew I couldn't just let it go. I needed guidance, not from another parenting blog or a self-help book, but from someone who could speak God's truth into the situation. And that's when I decided to call my pastor. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I knew I had to say something before the gap between me and my son became permanent. I don't usually call my pastor out of the blue. Sundays, we shake hands, exchange a few words, maybe share a quick laugh before the service. But this was different. My voice was low when I left the message on his phone: "Pastor, it's urgent. Can we talk today?" He called back within the hour. "Come by the church," he said. "I'll be here." When I walked into his office, it smelled faintly of old books and coffee. The walls were lined with shelves stacked high with Bibles, commentaries, and well-worn devotionals. A single lamp glowed on his desk, casting a warm light that somehow made the room feel safe. He stood up, shook my hand, and studied my face for a moment. "You look like you've been carrying something heavy," he said. I sat down across from him, my hands clenched together. For a few seconds, I couldn't even find the words. Finally, they came out, halting, awkward, almost embarrassed. "Pastor, my son, he told me he doesn't love me anymore." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't rush to fill the silence. He just waited. Something about that stillness made me open up more. I told him about the weeks of distance, the argument over the trash, the way I had snapped back at him. I told him how I couldn't stop hearing those words echo in my mind. When I finished, I braced myself for advice, maybe a lecture about patience, or communication, or setting boundaries. But he didn't start with advice. He reached for the Bible on his desk, the cover soft from years of use. "You know," he said slowly, "when God looks at his children, even when they're rebellious, even when they reject him, his love doesn't stop. It can't stop. Because it's not based on what we do. It's based on who he is." He flipped through the pages, his fingers moving like he knew exactly where he was going. "I think you need to be reminded of that kind of love today. I sat there, silent, as he found the passage. The sound of the thin pages turning felt almost sacred. Before he read, he looked at me again and said, "This isn't just about your son's heart. It's about yours, too." That line hit me harder than I expected. My heart? I had been so focused on what was wrong with my son that I hadn't even considered what God might want to change in me. He began to read, his voice calm but steady. Each word seemed to land heavier than the last. I could feel something shifting inside me, not a sudden fix, but a crack in the wall I'd been building around my own heart. I didn't interrupt. I didn't even look up. I just listened, letting the words wash over me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized this was the first time in days that my thoughts weren't running in circles. For the first time, I wasn't trying to figure out what to say next. I was just listening. When he finished, he closed the Bible gently and let the silence linger. Then he asked me one question that would stick with me long after I left his office. "What do you think your son needs from you most right now, your authority or your grace?" I swallowed hard. My instinct had always been to lead with authority. To be the strong father, the disciplinarian, the one who held the line. But in that moment, I realized that my son didn't need another lecture. He needed to know that my love for him wasn't going anywhere, no matter what he said, no matter how far he pulled away. We prayed together before I left. Not a polished prayer, not a long one, just a heartfelt request for God to soften my son's heart and mine. As I walked out of his office that day, I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know how my son would respond when I got home. But I knew one thing: I couldn't keep loving him conditionally. I had to love him the way God loves me, steadfast, patient, and without strings attached. And the passage the pastor had read to me? That was about to become the anchor for everything that happened next. The passage my pastor read that day was one I'd heard before. In fact, I'd probably heard it 100 times in Sunday services, weddings, and Bible studies. But sitting there in his office, with my heart cracked open and my relationship with my son hanging by a thread, it felt completely new. He turned to 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter. You might know it: love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. I'd always thought of that passage in the context of marriage or friendships, but as he read it slowly, deliberately, my mind kept replacing the word love with a father's love. A father's love is patient. A father's love is kind. It does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. A father's love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. I felt a lump in my throat as those words sank in. Because the truth was, I hadn't been patient. I hadn't been kind. I had been easily angered, quick to keep a mental list of the things my son had done wrong. Somewhere along the way, I had allowed frustration to become my default response instead of grace. The pastor closed his Bible and leaned forward slightly. "You can't control your son's words or actions," he said. "But you can control the way you love him. And the way you love him will shape the way he learns to love." I sat there, staring at my hands. My mind went back to the argument over the trash. I remembered the sharpness in my voice, the way my words had landed like stones. And then I thought about this passage, about patience, kindness, hope, perseverance. It was like God was holding up a mirror, showing me the gap between the way I thought I was loving my son and the way I actually was. Then my pastor said something that cut right to the heart: you can be right about the rules and still be wrong about the relationship. That hit me so hard I had to sit back in my chair. He was right. I had been so focused on winning the argument that I was losing my son. He continued, "The prodigal son's father didn't win his son back by making a case for why he was wrong. He won him back by being ready to embrace him the moment he came home. That's the picture of God's love for us, and it's the love your son needs to see from you." It was humbling, even painful, to realize that the first step wasn't convincing my son to love me again. The first step was deciding that my love for him would not be conditional, not on his attitude, not on his obedience, not even on his affection for me. We spent the next 20 minutes talking about what that would look like in practice. He told me to stop trying to have the talk right away. Your son's walls won't come down in a single conversation, he said. But they might start to crack if he begins to notice a change in the way you treat him. He gave me a simple challenge. For the next week, I was to look for small ways to show my son love without expecting anything in return. Not love as a reward for good behavior, but love as a constant presence. It sounded simple, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. It would mean holding my tongue when I wanted to correct him immediately. It would mean stepping into his world instead of insisting he come into mine. It would mean remembering that my ultimate goal wasn't control, it was connection. Before I left, my pastor prayed over me again. This time, I prayed with him, asking God to help me live out the kind of love described in 1 Corinthians 13. Not the watered-down, greeting card version of love, but the gritty, patient, enduring kind that stays steady even when it's not returned right away. As I drove home that day, the words of that passage echoed in my mind like a melody I couldn't forget. Love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if my son's heart would soften. But I knew this: if God's love could reach me when I was at my most stubborn, maybe, just maybe, it could reach my son too. And I was ready to let that be my starting point. I walked into the house that evening with a different posture than I'd had in weeks. Normally, after a day like the one I just had, I would have opened the door already braced for another argument or for cold silence from my son. But this time, I reminded myself of what the pastor had said: love first, without expecting anything in return. When I stepped into the living room, my son was on the couch, eyes glued to a video on his phone. The old me would have told him to put it down and help with dinner. Instead, I sat in the armchair across from him and asked, "What are you watching?" He shrugged without looking up. "Just something funny." "Can I see?" I asked. He hesitated for a second, then turned the phone toward me. We watched the clip together. It wasn't anything special, just some goofy prank video, but I laughed with him anyway. For a brief moment, I saw the faintest flicker of a smile on his face before he turned his attention back to the phone. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, I kept looking for little ways to connect. Instead of correcting every small thing he did wrong, I tried to notice the things he did right and actually say so out loud. When he emptied the dishwasher without being asked, I said, "Hey, thanks for doing that. I appreciate it." When he got a good grade on a quiz, I told him I was proud. At first, he didn't respond much. Sometimes he'd nod, sometimes he'd mumble thanks, sometimes he'd just walk away. But I kept at it, not because it was magically fixing everything, but because it was changing me. One evening, I decided to take it a step further. I knocked on his bedroom door and asked, "Want to go grab ice cream?" He looked at me like I just suggested we fly to the moon. "Right now?" "Yeah." My treat. We ended up sitting in a little ice cream shop a few blocks away, mostly in silence at first. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking about a video game he liked. Normally, I would have zoned out, but this time I leaned in, asking him questions, letting him explain all the little details. That night, when we got home, I realized something: connection isn't built in big, dramatic gestures. It's built in these small, consistent moments of showing up. Still, there were hard days. There were times he'd still snap at me or retreat into his room. My old instincts wanted to react, to shut it down, to take it personally. But every time, I remembered the words from 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient. Love is kind. And patience isn't just waiting, it's waiting without resentment. Kindness isn't just about what you say, it's about how you say it, even when you're frustrated. A week after my conversation with the pastor, I decided it was time to share something with my son. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and I said, "I want to tell you something. The other day, when we argued and you said you didn't love me anymore, that hurt. But I also want you to know, I love you. And nothing you say or do will change that." He looked down at his plate, not saying anything for a while. I didn't push him. I just let the words sit there. Finally, he said quietly, "Okay." It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't a Hallmark moment. But it was a tiny crack in the wall. And cracks let light in. Over the next few weeks, those cracks widened. We laughed more. We talked more. Sometimes he'd even initiate a conversation, which felt like a small miracle. One night, we were watching a movie together, and without saying anything, he leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder, just like he used to when he was little. That's when I knew God was answering my prayer. Slowly, gently, in ways I couldn't force and wouldn't have scripted, he was restoring what had been broken. It didn't mean everything was perfect. Parenting is still messy. Relationships still take work. But now I was leading with grace instead of control, connection instead of correction. And that changed everything. It happened on a Wednesday evening, about a month after that day in my pastor's office. We had just finished dinner, nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread, and I was rinsing dishes at the sink. My son had been quieter than usual all day, and I assumed it was just one of those moods. But then, without me saying a word, he walked into the kitchen and stood there. "Dad," he said. I turned around, dish towel in hand. "Yeah?" He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I'm sorry for what I said that day." The words hung in the air. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I just let them sit there, giving them the weight they deserved. Finally, I said, "Thank you. That means a lot to me." He nodded, then added, "I didn't mean it. I was mad. I just felt like you didn't care about me anymore." That hit me like a punch to the gut. I stepped closer and said, "I'm sorry too. I know I haven't always shown you how much I care. I've let other things get in the way. But I promise, you are more important to me than all of that." His eyes welled up a little, just enough for me to notice, and before I could say anything else, he stepped forward and hugged me. Not one of those quick, one-arm, let's get this over with hugs. This was different. It was long. It was real. And I'll be honest, I held on a little longer than I probably needed to. Something shifted in that moment. It wasn't just forgiveness. It was trust starting to grow back. It was the realization, for both of us, that love could survive hurt if we were willing to fight for it. In the days that followed, I noticed small but powerful changes. He started coming into the living room just to hang out, even if we weren't talking. He'd tell me about his day without me having to ask first. Sometimes he'd even join me when I was working on something in the garage. One Saturday morning, we were in the driveway washing the car together. Out of nowhere, he said, "Hey, Dad. Want to throw the football around later?" It was such a simple question, but to me, it was a sign that the walls were coming down brick by brick. We still had disagreements, because that's life, but they didn't spiral into days of silence or slam doors anymore. Now, we could talk them through. And I made sure, even in moments of correction, to remind him that I loved him. Looking back, I realized something important. The turning point wasn't just when he apologized. It was when I decided, weeks earlier, to change the way I loved him, consistently, patiently, without keeping score. That decision created the space for this breakthrough to happen. And here's the truth, sometimes God's restoration doesn't come all at once. Sometimes it's not a lightning bolt, it's a sunrise. Slow. Gradual. But undeniably real. That Wednesday night hug was my sunrise. When I think back to that day, the slammed door, the words "I don't love you anymore," it feels like a lifetime ago. At the time, I thought those words were the end of something. But now I see they were the beginning of a new chapter God was writing in both of our lives. It wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't about me finding the perfect parenting technique or saying all the right words. It was about God showing me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. A daily decision to put patience before frustration, kindness before correction, and grace before judgment. That passage from 1 Corinthians 13 became my anchor. It reminded me that my job as a father isn't just to raise a well-behaved son. It's to love him the way God loves me, unconditionally, even when I fall short. And here's the thing, maybe you're watching this because you've had your own "I don't love you anymore" moment. Maybe it wasn't from a child, maybe it was from a spouse, a sibling, a friend. And maybe you felt that same hollow ache in your chest, wondering if the relationship could ever be restored. I want you to know this: if God's love can reach into my stubborn, impatient, imperfect heart and soften it, He can do the same in your situation. Restoration is possible. Forgiveness is possible. Hope is possible. It starts with you choosing to love first, even if the other person isn't ready to meet you halfway yet. It starts with small acts, quiet prayers, and a commitment to stay even when it would be easier to walk away. If you take nothing else from this story, take this: love that perseveres changes things. Not always overnight, not always in the way we expect, but always in the way God knows is best. Thank you for letting me share my heart today. If this story has encouraged you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that love, real love, never fails.